2018, the quiet suburbs of Columbus, Ohio were rocked by a shocking discovery. What began as a festive family reunion at the home of Peter and Claire Dawson ended in bloodshed. The next morning, Peter Dawson, a 54-year-old contractor, was found dead in the backyard of his home, his body battered, lying motionless on the damp grass. The gruesome discovery shattered the tranquility of the neighborhood, but the murder would soon reveal far more than just a tragic crime. Hidden beneath the veneer of the Dawsons' long marriage was a tangled web of deceit, betrayal, and forbidden passion. As investigators dug deeper, they would uncover a secret affair that had festered behind closed doors, and a murder that no one could have. Claire Dawson's sister, Laura Peterson, made the harrowing discovery. The night before, the Dawsons had hosted a lively family reunion at their suburban home, a spacious two-story brick house in one of Columbus's affluent neighborhoods. The event had brought together relatives from both sides of the family, including Peter's brother, Greg Dawson, and his wife, as well as friends and co-workers. What was supposed to be a joyful celebration had taken a dark turn overnight. Laura had woken up early, stepping outside to get some fresh air before the family gathered for breakfast. As she strolled onto the back porch, her eyes fell on a horrific scene. Peter's body sprawled on the lawn, a pool of blood staining the grass around his head. His face was bruised and swollen, and the jagged wound on his skull made it clear that this was no accident. Panicking, Laura screamed for help, and Claire came rushing down from upstairs. The police were called immediately, and soon Detective Maria Hart, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for detail, arrived on the scene with her team. Hart was a methodical detective, known for her ability to piece together complex puzzles. She had worked her share of homicides, but the peaceful setting of the Dawsons' home clashed violently with the grisly murder before her. Peter's body lay face down, his hands showing signs of defensive wounds, suggesting that he had fought back against his forced entry into the home. The house itself was immaculate, the remnants of the previous night's reunion still visible in the dining room, where plates and glasses sat untouched since the festivities ended. Claire Dawson, the grieving widow, appeared composed but shaken. She told detectives that, after the guests had left, she and Peter had gone to bed early following a brief argument. She claimed that Peter had wanted to discuss a troubling topic, his suspicions that she was having an affair with one of her co-workers, but she had brushed it off, tired from the night's events. She said she had gone upstairs to their bedroom and had no idea what had happened after she fell asleep. The initial interviews with family members revealed conflicting accounts of the night. Some of the guests, including Peter's brother Greg, had overheard the argument between Peter and Claire, though none had witnessed any physical violence. A few guests had stayed late, including Claire's co-worker Ethan Marks, the man Peter had accused her of having an affair with. But Claire vehemently denied any romantic involvement with Ethan, claiming that they were merely friends and colleagues. Detective Hart noted Claire's calm demeanor with interest. Grief often manifested in unpredictable ways, but Claire's lack of visible distress struck Hart as unusual. Claire didn't have a team comb through the backyard for clues, but the scene was frustratingly clean. There were no clear footprints other than those belonging to Peter, no obvious murder weapon in sight, and no signs of forced entry. However, there was a peculiar detail that caught the detective's attention. Peter had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, likely from a heavy object, but the weapon was nowhere to be found. The investigation was only just beginning, but one thing was clear. Peter Dawson hadn't died by accident. He had been murdered, and the events of the previous night hinted at dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of the Dawsons' seemingly perfect life. As Detective Hart and her team began to dig into Peter and Claire's personal lives, it quickly became apparent that their marriage wasn't as picture-perfect as it seemed. On the surface, the Dawsons had been the epitome of a successful, stable couple. Peter had built a thriving contracting business, and Claire had carved out a career as a well-respected secretary at a local newspaper. They had been married for over 30 years, raised 2 children who were now adults. She discovered a marriage strained by years of unresolved tensions. Peter's accusations of Claire's affair with her co-worker, Ethan Marks, weren't without basis. Peter had confided in close friends in the weeks leading up to his death that he believed Claire was seeing someone else. He had grown suspicious of her increasingly secretive behavior, late nights at work, unexplained absences, and the sudden influx of texts and phone calls from numbers Peter didn't recognize. Claire, however, denied everything. During her interview with detectives, she maintained that her relationship with Ethan was purely professional. Ethan, 36, was a sports reporter at the same newspaper where Claire worked, and while they had become friendly over the years, Claire insisted there was nothing romantic between them. Still, the evidence painted a different picture. Detectives began by examining Claire's phone records, which revealed frequent communication with Ethan over the past few months. While most of the texts appeared innocuous, discussions about work, upcoming events, and night outside of typical work hours, and their contents were unclear. Claire had been using a messaging app that allowed for disappearing messages, a tactic often used by people trying to keep their communications hidden. Suspicion deepened when detectives uncovered hotel receipts from a local inn, where Claire had stayed on multiple occasions under the pretense of business trips. The dates of her stays aligned suspiciously with weekends when Peter had been out of town on work. When confronted with the evidence, Claire downplayed the significance of the hotel stays, claiming she had used the time to relax and unwind from the stress of her job. But the detectives weren't convinced. Ethan Marks was called in for questioning. Unlike Claire, Ethan appeared nervous from the start. Though he denied any romantic involvement with Claire, he struggled to provide concrete answers about their relationship. When asked about the encrypted messages, Ethan claimed they were simply casual exchanges, but his body language suggested otherwise. He fidgeted in his seat, avoiding direct eye contact with detective. More troubling evidence: financial discrepancies in the Dawsons' accounts. Peter had been the primary breadwinner throughout their marriage, but in the months before his death, he had transferred a significant amount of money from their joint account into a private one. Claire had noticed the transfers, but when asked about them, she claimed to have no idea why Peter had made those financial moves. Hart began to suspect that Peter's suspicions of an affair had gone beyond mere jealousy. The large withdrawals suggested that Peter had been preparing for something, possibly a divorce or legal action against Claire. If Peter had confronted Claire about the missing money and her potential affair, it could have led to the argument that ultimately escalated into violence. But as the investigation deepened, more questions arose. Was Claire truly having an affair with Ethan? Or was she using him as a smokescreen for something else? And what about the missing murder weapon? The lack of physical evidence left the detectives grasping at theories, but nothing seemed to fully explain Peter's involvement. While the evidence pointed to marital discord and a potential affair, detectives knew they were missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. Claire's alibi had been simple. After the family reunion, she had gone to bed early, hoping to avoid further confrontation with Peter. She claimed that she hadn't heard anything unusual during the night and had woken up to Laura's frantic screams the next morning. But as investigators pieced together the timeline of the night, Claire's story started to fall apart. Several neighbors reported hearing raised voices coming from the Dawsons' backyard late at night, long after the reunion had ended. One neighbor, who lived directly behind the Dawsons, told detectives that he had heard an argument around 11:30 p.m., followed by what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the yard. Another neighbor recalled seeing the lights in the house flicker on and off during the early hours of the morning, suggesting that she stayed up later than she had admitted. Had the argument between her and Peter continued into the night, escalating to violence? To complicate matters further, the investigation uncovered fractures within the Dawson family itself. While Claire's sister Laura seemed genuinely shocked by Peter's death, there was tension between Peter and his brother, Greg Dawson, that had long been brewing beneath the surface. Greg, who had attended the reunion, had a history of conflict with Peter. While they had maintained a cordial relationship for the sake of family gatherings, Greg had always resented Peter's success as a contractor. In fact, Peter had once bailed Greg out of a financial crisis related to a failed business venture, a debt that Greg had never fully repaid. Detective Hart considered Greg as a potential suspect, given his strained relationship with Peter. Was it possible that Greg had finally acted on his long-standing resentment? Could the argument between Claire and Peter have provided the perfect cover for Greg to commit the murder? Greg denied any involvement, insisting that while he and Peter had their differences, he had nothing to gain from his brother's death. Still, he also continued to scrutinize Ethan Marks. His evasive responses during questioning had raised red flags, and detectives believed that he was hiding something. Further digging into Ethan's background revealed that he had a history of inappropriate relationships with female coworkers at previous jobs, though none had led to any formal complaints or charges. Could Ethan's relationship with Claire have gone further than he admitted? Had he been driven by jealousy or fear that Peter would expose their affair? To gain more insight into Ethan's possible involvement, investigators tracked down a former coworker who had worked with Ethan at his previous job. She described Ethan as charming but manipulative, someone who knew how to get what he wanted. While she had never been involved with him personally, she had witnessed his flirtations with other women in the office, many of whom were married. Her account painted a picture of a man who enjoyed the thrill of secret relationships, but there was no concrete evidence linking him to Peter's murder. Meanwhile, the forensic team had made a small but significant discovery: a trace of blood found on the back porch, not far from where Peter's body had been found. The blood didn't belong to Peter, raising the possibility that the killer had been injured during the attack. Additionally, footprints found in the soft ground near the edge of the... But whose? The forensic team also analyzed the trace amounts of oil found on Peter's body, which seemed to have been transferred from the murder weapon. The type of oil matched what would typically be found on tools used in construction work, leading detectives to believe that the weapon was likely something from Peter's own tool collection: a wrench, hammer, or similar object. Yet the murder weapon still hadn't been found, and the question of who had used it remained unanswered. As the investigation wore on, the detectives' list of potential suspects grew longer, but so did the complexity of the case. Claire remained the primary focus, but Greg's unresolved issues with his brother and Ethan's ambiguous relationship with Claire both provided compelling motives. With no clear physical evidence linking any of them directly to the crime, however, the case remained frustratingly open-ended. Just when Detective Hart thought the investigation was heading in the right direction, a surprising new lead shifted suspicion away from Claire and her family members. A neighbor came forward with information that sent the case spiraling in a new direction. She had seen an unfamiliar car just hours before Peter was killed. The neighbor had initially thought nothing of it, but as the investigation intensified, she realized it might be relevant. Detectives traced the car to David Henderson, a former business associate of Peter's, who had parted ways with him after a bitter financial dispute. Peter and David had once worked together on several construction projects, but their relationship soured after a failed investment in a real estate deal. According to Peter's business records, David had threatened legal action against Peter just weeks before his death, claiming that Peter owed him a significant sum of money from their last project. When detectives questioned David about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, he provided a shaky alibi. He claimed that he had been out of town visiting family, but further investigation revealed that no one could confirm his story. Phone records showed that David had made a call from a cell tower near the Dawson residence around the time of the murder, placing him in the area. Potential dispute? Did he see the family reunion as an opportunity to confront Peter and settle the score? David, for his part, denied any involvement in the murder. He admitted to being frustrated with Peter over the failed business deal, but insisted that he had no reason to harm him. Still, his presence near the crime scene raised serious doubts about his innocence. As the focus shifted to David, forensic analysts worked to piece together the timeline of the murder. The footprints found in the backyard were a match for David's shoe size, and the oil residue on Peter's body was consistent with the type of tools David had used in his construction work. Additionally, a neighbor reported hearing raised voices in the backyard just before midnight, suggesting that David and Peter had argued before the fatal blow was struck. Then came the most significant discovery yet: the murder weapon. A few days after David was brought in for questioning, a large wrench was found in a nearby creek, partially submerged in the water. The wrench, covered in mud and rust, had traces of Peter's blood on it. Forensic analysis also revealed traces of oil on the wrench, matching the type used in Peter's construction business. Investigators believed that David had used the wrench to kill Peter and then discarded it in the creek to cover his tracks. With the move forward, Detective Hart couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. David Henderson sat in the interrogation room, his hands trembling as he recounted his version of events. He had gone to the Dawson house that night, he admitted, but insisted that Peter was already dead when he arrived. "I didn't kill him," David muttered, his voice shaky. "When I got there, he was lying on the ground. I panicked and ran. I was afraid I'd be blamed for something I didn't do." Detective Hart listened carefully, her instincts telling her that there was more to David's story. He was hiding something. But what? The wrench found in the creek had Peter's blood on it, but no fingerprints. Had David used it, or had someone else? As Hart dug deeper, she discovered a series of text messages between David and Claire in the days leading up to the murder. The messages were cryptic, but they suggested that Claire and David had been in contact about more than just Peter's business dealings. One particular message from Claire stood out. "We need to meet. I don't want him finding out." The implications of the message were clear. Claire had been orchestrating more than just an affair with Ethan. She had involved David in her scheme to confront Peter. As Hart continued to review the evidence, game of deception. She had convinced David to confront Peter about the financial dispute, knowing that the situation could escalate into violence. Further investigation revealed that Claire had been siphoning money from Peter's business accounts for months. She had used her access to the family's finances to funnel money into a separate account in her name, and when Peter began to suspect something was wrong, she had devised a plan to get rid of him. But there was one final piece of the puzzle that would cement Claire's role in the murder. A forensic analysis of the mud found on David's shoes revealed traces of dirt consistent with the backyard where Peter was killed. The pattern of the footprints matched those found near the crime scene, confirming that David had been present during the murder. Under mounting pressure, David finally broke down and confessed. He admitted that he had confronted Peter in the backyard that night and in a fit of rage struck him with the wrench. But he maintained that it was their move. Claire Dawson was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, while David was charged with second-degree murder. As news of the arrest spread, the case became a media sensation. The once glamorous Claire, known for her beauty and charm, was now at the center of a shocking murder trial. The prosecution laid out a detailed case against Claire, arguing that she had orchestrated the entire plot to kill Peter. They presented evidence of her affair with Ethan, her financial crimes, and her manipulation of David. Claire's defense, on the other hand, portrayed her as a victim of circumstance. They claimed that Claire had been trapped in a loveless marriage and had turned to Ethan for emotional support. They insisted that David had acted alone, driven by his own resentment toward Peter. The trial lasted several weeks, with both sides presenting compelling arguments. Forensic experts testified about the evidence linking David to the crime scene, and witnesses described Claire's erratic behavior in the months leading up to the murder. But the most damning testimony came from David himself. On the stand, he recounted how Claire had convinced him to confront Peter, manipulating him into believing that Peter was a threat to both of them. In the end, the jury found Claire guilty of conspiracy to murder. The trial may have ended, but the fallout from Peter Dawson's murder continued to reverberate through the community. The Dawson family, once a symbol of stability and success, was now forever tarnished by the scandal. Peter's relatives, who had once supported Claire, were devastated by the revelations of her betrayal. Claire's children, now adults, struggled to come to terms with the fact that their mother had been responsible for their father's death. For Claire, life in prison was a stark contrast to the glamorous life she had once led. The woman who had thrived on attention and admiration now found herself alone, stripped of her power and influence. Over the years, she would reflect on the choices that had led her to this point, but there would be no redemption. Her beauty and charm, once her greatest assets, were now meaningless behind the bars of a prison cell. David Henderson, too, would live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. He had been drawn into Claire's web of deceit, believing that he was acting out of a sense of justice. But in the end, he had thrown away his life for a woman who had manipulated him for her own gain. Ethan marked over, and his relationship with Claire would forever be a stain on his record. He had been a willing participant in Claire's affair, but he had narrowly escaped being dragged into her deadly plan. As for Detective Maria Hart, the case had been one of the most complex and emotionally charged of her career. The layers of deception, manipulation, and betrayal had tested her skills as an investigator, but in the end, justice had been served. Yet the case left her with a lingering sense of unease, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind even the most perfect facades. The Dawson murder would go down in history as one of the most chilling cases of betrayal and manipulation. What had started as a family reunion had ended in bloodshed, and the story of Claire Dawson's double life would serve as a cautionary tale for years to come. The facade of perfection had been shattered, revealing the tragic consequences of greed, deceit, and unchecked